Good evening, everybody. Welcome in. How are you doing tonight, Raiders? Moons, thank you for the raid. Let me give you a shout out here. How are you all doing tonight? It's great to have you here. Let me move my mic just a little bit. I have to mute you for that to happen. It's lots of noise. Thank you for the raid. Oh, hey, Swift, welcome. Give Moons a quick shout out. If anybody watching the stream tonight does not follow Moons Dancer, I highly recommend that you do. She's 26 and she likes playing games and saying the random things that pop into her head. Also, just a really fun stream. You'll laugh a lot. But putting this music down, I realize it's pretty loud. There we are. Swift. So you said, okay, I would actually be interested in watching a reading stream specifically and would probably genuinely pay attention, as odd as that sounds. Oh, I love that. I love audiobooks, so I completely get it. In fact, I'll turn on reading streams to help me go to sleep, or more like reading YouTube videos. So it's nice, and I'm glad that you're looking forward to it. That really means a lot, and I hope that you'll enjoy the book, because I really do. At least the first half. I haven't read it all, but I feel pretty confident in it. So we're reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and this was written in 1895, something like that. It's down there in the description. So this is late Victorian London. And the Victorian era was really known for the extreme wealth inequality. Some would say worse than we are experiencing today. But it's really hard to say. But there were a significant amount of people that were starting to really chafe against that ruling class that was subjugating people and making them work the land, the real king serf system, right? And this author, H.G. Wells, wrote this book partially as a critique against the ruling class. If you took that structure, well, I'll stop right there. I don't want to spoil it for you, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a frame of reference of the place and time that we're in. We're in London, is where this author wrote the book. So having a context for the place and time of something, I think, can help you process it. At least it does for me. So you said, Swift, you should do that. You watch video essays at night, assuming they'll be relaxing, but they're made by a person who has no concept of long-form videos being better when they're calm, and they make a bunch of noise. Oh, yeah. I know. When you're dealing with long-form content, you kind of gotta sometimes don't go hard on the constant dopamine stuff, right? Make it an enjoyable watching experience. I do believe right now it's technically very slightly worse, at least in America. I can believe it. I really can. Moon's quote number 12. So I will not threaten violence on this stream, but I will imply it. That's one of my favorite quotes, and it has nothing to do with balls or butts or other things of that nature. stretch? Thank you. I will do a stretch. It's very good. I was, before the stream, I was playing Planet Coaster. And so I've been sitting for a while, and I did not do any, like, vocal exercises. I'm gonna change the song. It's a little aggressive. It's pretty. It's a little loud. That's okay. It'll be fun regardless. Actually, you think that was from right before the French Revolution. It's mildly before that. Yes, yeah, a lot of these European nations went through a similar, like a similar experience, right? So I'm really bad with history. I was never very good in school, but yeah, it's just the culture and access to things, Swift says, is very different, but the numbers when compared are slightly worse in America. I can believe it. I can believe it. So this book might be even more prescient today. Perhaps. Maybe. So let me pour myself a cup of tea, and I would love to hear how you all are doing. And I forgot to put a pinned comment. Please feel free to chat, and I will catch up with you between chapters. I'm saying this as I type and also saying it to you all. So I will, basically the format, if you weren't here for the previous reading stream, is I will read a chapter and then I'll pause. We'll catch up with chat, kind of have conversation, whether it's about the chapter or whatever, and then move into the next one. But during this whole thing, please feel free to chat with each other. Let me manually unpin. Let's go. So yeah, please feel free to chat with each other during the read. Yeah, and I'll make sure that I catch you all between chapters. Let me pour that tea real quick and we will get started. Tonight I am drinking decaf green tea. Let's see here. Yeah, I don't think you're catching the sound of the tea pouring. I've been told that it doesn't sound super great. And tonight I thought I might cover my teapot with a little towel, just in case that does anything to keep the heat in. I don't know if it will, but I will report as the stream continues to let you know what I discover. Shall we get started? I'm gonna go ahead and bring the music down. There we are. Take a sip of this really warm tea and we'll start reading. It's very good. All right. Chapter 1. Introduction. The time traveler, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite matter to us. His pale gray eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burnt brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon, and there was that luxurious after-dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox as we thought it, and his fecundity. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school is founded on a misconception. Is it not that rather a large thing to expect us to begin upon? Said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness, nil, has no real existence. They taught you that? Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That is all right, said the psychologist. Nor having length, breadth, thickness can a cube have, nor having only length, breadth, and thickness can a cube have a real existence. There I object, said Philby. Of course a solid body may exist, all real things, so most people think. But wait a moment, can an instantaneous cube exist? I don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded, any real body must have an extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we incline to overlook this fact. There are really 4 dimensions, 3 which we call the 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw upon an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the latter from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that is very clear indeed. Now, it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveler, with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the 4th dimension, though some people who talk about the 4th dimension do not know they mean it. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the 3 dimensions of space, except that our consciousness moves along it. But some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of that idea. You have all heard what they have to say about this 4th dimension. Well, I have not, said the provincial mayor. It is simply this, that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of having 3 dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to 3 planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking why 3 dimensions particularly. Why not another direction at right angles to the other 3? And have even tried to construct a 4-dimensional geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface, which has only 2 dimensions, we can represent a figure of a 3-dimensional solid. And similarly, they think that by models of 3 dimensions, they can represent one of 4, even if they could master the perspective of the thing. See? I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows, he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. "Yes, I think I see it now," he said after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. "Well, I do not mind telling you that I have been at work upon this geometry of 4 dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All these are evidently sections, as it were, the 3-dimensional representation of his 4-dimensioned being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Scientific people," proceeded the time traveler, after the pause required for the proper assimilation of this, "know very well that the time is only a kind of space. Here's a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my finger shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high. Yesterday night it fell, and this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but certainly it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must conclude, was along the time dimension." "But," said the medical man, staring hard at the coal in the fire, "if time is really only a 4th dimension of space, why is it, and why has it always been, regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space?" The time traveler smiled. "Are you so sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backward and forward freely enough, and men have always done so. I admit we move freely in 2 dimensions. And how about up and down? Gravitation limits us there." "Oh, not exactly," said the medical man. "There are balloons." "But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement." "Still, they could move a little up and down," said the medical man. "Easier, far easier down than up." "And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment." "My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is just where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface." "But the great difficulty is this," interrupted the psychologist. "You can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. That is the germ of my great discovery, that you were wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recalling an incident very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon, and why should he not hope that ultimately he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift among the time dimension, or even turn about and travel the other way?" "Oh, this," began Philby, "is all—" "Why not?" said the time traveler. "It's against reason," said Philby. "What reason?" said the time traveler. "You can show black is white by argument," said Philby, "but you will never convince me." "Possibly not," said the time traveler. "But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of the 4 dimensions. Long ago, I had a vague inkling of a machine. To travel through time, exclaimed the very young man, that shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time as the driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. But I have experimental verification, said the time traveler. It would be remarkably convenient for the historian, the psychologist suggested. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings for existence. Don't you think you would attract attention? Said the medical man. Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato, said the very young man. In which case they would certainly plow you from the little go. The German scholars have improved Greek so much. Then there is the future, said the very young man. Just think, one might invest all one's money, leave it to accumulate an interest, and hurry on ahead. To discover a society, said I, erected on a strictly communistic basis. Of all the wild, extravagant theories, began the psychologist. Yes, so it seemed to me, and so I never talked of it until experimental verification, cried I. You were going to verify that? The experiment, cried Philby, who was getting brain weary. Let's see your experiment anyhow, said the psychologist, though it's all humbug, you know. The time traveler smiled round at us. Then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trousers pockets, he walked slowly out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. I wonder what he's got. Some sleight of hand trick or the other, said the medical man, and Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he had seen at Burlesome. But before he had finished his preface, the time traveler came back, and Philby's antidote collapsed. That was chapter 1. It's going to take me a second to warm up, I think. I did not warm myself up before the stream like I normally do. That's okay. I might stumble over a word or two, but clap, thank you, Moons. I'm going to take a few sips of my tea. I'll go ahead and change over. Let's see. I'm going to check. There we are. Chapter 2, The Machine. Actually, I'm going to chug a little bit of water before we do this. There we go. Oh, thank you, Moons. There's a lot of big words in here. It's a little tough. Chapter number 2. The Machine. The thing the time traveler held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework, scarcely larger than a small clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it, and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit, for this that follows, unless his explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that were scattered about the room and set it in front of the fire, with 2 legs on the hearthrug. On this table he placed the mechanism. Then he drew up a chair and sat down. The only other object on the table was a small shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about, 2 in brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several in sconces, so that the room was brilliantly illuminated. I sat in a low armchair nearest the fire, and I drew this forward so as to be almost between the time traveler and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him, looking over his shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him profile from the right, and the psychologist from the left. The very young man stood before the psychologist. We were all on the alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived and however adroitly done, could have been played upon us under these conditions. The time traveler looked at us and then at the mechanism. "Well," said the psychologist. "This little affair," said the time traveler, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands together above the apparatus, "is only a model. It is my plan for a machine to travel through time. You will notice that it looks singularly askew and that there's an odd twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it were in some way unreal." He pointed to the part with his finger. "Also, here is one little white lever, and here is another." The medical man got up out of his chair and peered into the thing. "It's beautifully made," he said. "It took 2 years to make," retorted the time traveler. Then, when he had all imitated the action of the medical man, he said, "Now I want you clearly to understand that this lever, being pressed over, sends the machine gliding into the future, and this other reverses the motion. This saddle represents the seat of a time traveler. Presently, I am going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It will vanish, pass into the future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing, and look at the table too, and satisfy yourselves there is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model and then be told that I'm a quack." There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed to think... Sorry, let me take a sip of my tea here. There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind. Then the time traveler put forth his finger toward the lever. "No," he said suddenly. "Lend me your hand." And turning to the psychologist, he took that individual's hand in his own and told him to put out his forefinger, so that it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the model time machine on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I am absolutely certain there was no trickery. There was a breath of wind and the lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung around, became indistinct, was seen as a ghost for a second perhaps, as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory, and it was gone. Vanished, save for the lamp. The table was bare. Everyone was silent for a minute. Then Philby said he was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. "Well," he said, with a reminiscence of the psychologist. Then, getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel and with his back to us began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. "Look here," said the medical man. "Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that this machine has traveled into time?" "Certainly," said the time traveler, stooping to light a spill at the fire. Then he turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. "What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there," he indicated the laboratory. "And when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account." "You mean to say that that machine has traveled into the future?" said Philby. "Into the future or the past? I don't for certain know which." After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. It must have gone into the past if it had gone anywhere, he said. Why? Said the time traveler. Because I presume that it has not moved in space, and if it traveled into the future, it would still be here all this time, since it must have traveled through this time. But, said I, if I traveled into the past, it would have been visible from when we first came into this room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so forth. Serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor with an air of impartiality, turning toward the time traveler. Not a bit, said the time traveler, and to the psychologist. You think you can explain that? Its presentation below the threshold, diluted presentation. Of course, said the psychologist, and reassured us. That's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning or a bullet flying through the air. If it is traveling through time 50 times or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets through a minute while we get through a second, the impression it creates will, of course, be only 1/50th or 1/100th of what it would make if it were not traveling in time. That's plain enough. He passed his hand through the space in which the machine had been. You see, he said, laughing. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then, the time traveler asked us what we thought of it all. It sounds plausible enough tonight, said the medical man, but wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. Would you like to see the time machine itself? Asked the time traveler. And therewith, taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, drafty corridor into his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer broad head in silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish from before our eyes. Parts were nickel, parts of ivory, parts had certainly been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench beside some sheets of drawing, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz, it seemed to be. Look here, said the medical man. Are you perfectly serious, or is this a trick, like that ghost you showed us last Christmas? Upon that machine, said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life. None of us quite knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me solemnly. What's chapter 2? The machine. Hey, Chase, welcome in, my friend. How are you doing tonight? I hope you're having a good night. And yes, Moon's big words are scary. Big old words. Fecundity. That's a fun word. And pineapple is an amazing word. Welcome in, Batman Guy. I hope you're having a great night and enjoying this classic sci-fi. It's pretty fun. I enjoy it so far. So I'm going to take a chug of water here. Let me see what our ad situation is as well. We have 11 minutes before ads. It's a pretty short chapter. I think we can get through it. That drink. The ever-looming ad horizon, so true. So true, and especially in the cases of books, it's like you can't let people miss it. They'll be so confused. And it's also great to take a voice break because I think so far book reading streams have been some of my favorites. But it does take a lot out of the voice, that's for sure. Here we go. Chapter 3. The Time Traveler Returns. I think that at that time, none of us quite believed in the time machine. And the fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who are too clever to be believed. You never felt that you saw all round him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity in ambush behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time traveler's words, we should have known him far less skepticism. For we should have perceived his motives. A pork butcher could understand Philby. But the time traveler had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the fame of a less clever man seem tricks in his hands. It is a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never felt quite sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I don't think any of us said very much about time traveling in the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism and of utter confusion it suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model that I remember discussing with the medical man whom I met on Friday at the Linnaean. He said he had seen a similar thing at Tübingen and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle. But how the trick was done, he could not explain. The next Thursday, I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveler's most constant guests, and arriving late, found 4 or 5 men already assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked round for the time traveler, and "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose we better have dinner." "Where's," said I, naming our host. "You've just come. It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. He asks me in this note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes." "It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and thereupon the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person beside the doctor and myself who had attended the previous dinner. The other men were blank, the editor aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another, a quiet, shy man with a beard whom I didn't know, and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveler's absence, and I suggested time traveling in a half-jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we had witnessed that day week. He was in the middle of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," I said, "at last," and the door opened wider and the time traveler stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens, man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man who saw him next, and the whole table full turned toward the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty and smeared with green down the sleeves, his hair disordered, and, as it seemed to me, grayer, either with dust and dirt or because its color had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, a cut half healed. His expression was haggard and drawn as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he had been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in foot-store tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. Take a sip of my tea real fast. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion toward the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and pushed it toward him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good, for he looked round the table and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveler did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said with a certain faltering articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint color came into his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, and then went round the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as it were feeling his way among his words. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time traveler. "I'm funny. Be all right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked toward the staircase door. Again I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place, I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool-gathering. Then, "Remarkable behavior of an eminent scientist," I heard the editor say, thinking after his wont in headlines. And this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. "What's the game?" said the journalist. "Has he been doing the amateur cadger? I don't follow." I met the eye of the psychologist and read my own interpretation in his face. I thought of the time traveler limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness. The first to recover completely from this surprise was the medical man, who rang the bell. The time traveler hated to have servants waiting at dinner for a hot plate. And at that, the editor turned to his knife and fork with a grunt, and the silent man followed suit. The dinner was resumed. Conversation was exclamatory for a little while with gaps of wonderment, and then the editor got fervent in his curiosity. "Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing? Or has he his Nebuchadnezzar phases?" he inquired. "I feel assured it's this business of the time machine," I said, and I looked up the psychologist's account of our previous meeting. The new guests were frankly incredulous. The editor raised objections. What was this time traveling? A man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling in a paradox, could he? And then, as the idea came home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't they any clothes brushes in the future? The journalist, too, would not believe at any price, and joined the editor in the easy work of heaping ridicule onto the whole thing. They were both the new kind of journalist, very joyous, irreverent young men. "Our special correspondent in the Day After Tomorrow reports," the journalist was saying, or rather shouting, when the time traveler came back. He was dressed in ordinary evening clothes, and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that had startled me. "I say," said the editor hilariously, "these chaps here say you have been traveling into the middle of next week. Tell us all about the little Roseberry, will you? What will you take for the lot?" The time traveler came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly in his old way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "What a treat it is to stick a fork into meat again." "Story!" cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveler. "I want something to eat. I will not say a word until I get some peptone into my arteries. Thanks." And the salt. All right, we're actually going to take a break there. We're already 20% through the book, and if you do get these advertisements that are starting in about 5 to 10 seconds, don't watch them. Stand up. Get yourself a bevy. I'm going to do that, and I will see you in just a couple minutes. And hi, Snap, it's good to see you. Words are scary. I'll be right back. Thank you all for your patience while I stood up, and I hope you did the same. You know what I didn't do is pour my tea, so I'm gonna do that real quick. Could also just change that over too, right? You know, I could. So we did stop in the middle of the chapter. That's okay. Chase, congratulations on... there's this number after 3, or before 3? After 1.5. I think it's called 2. Congratulations on 2nd, my friend. So we'll go back for just a touch of context. So, the time traveler came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly in his old way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "What a treat it is to stick a fork into meat again." "Story!" cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveler. "I want something to eat. I won't say a word until I get some Peptone into my arteries." "Thanks. And the salt?" "1 word," said I. "Have you been time traveling?" "Yes," said the time traveler with his mouth full, nodding his head. "I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note," said the editor. The time traveler pushed his glass toward the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. That sentence again. The time traveler pushed his glass toward the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept rising to my lips, and I dare say it was the same with the others. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Hetty Potter. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveler through his eyelashes. The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual and drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. At last, the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked round us. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving. I've had a most amazing time." He reached out his hand for a cigar and cut the end. "But come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates." And, ringing the bell in passing, he led the way into the adjoining room. "You have told Blank and Dash and Chose about the machines," he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair and naming the 3 guests. "But the thing's a mere paradox," said the editor. "I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue. I will," he went on, "tell you the story of what happened to me if you'd like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Most of it will sound like lying. So be it. It's true, every word of it, all the same. I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since then I've lived 8 days, such days as no human being ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shan't sleep till I've told this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed, but no interruptions. Is it agreed?" "Agreed," said the editor, and the rest of us echoed, "Agreed." And with that, the time traveler began his story as I have set it forth. He sat back in his chair at first and spoke like a weary man. Afterwards, he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all, my own inadequacy to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of the little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You cannot know how his expression followed the turns of this story. Most of us hearers were in shadow, for the candles in the smoking room had not been lighted, and only the face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from the knees downward were illuminated. At first we glanced now and again at each other, and after a time we ceased to do that and looked only at the time traveler's face. And this is chapter 4. You're right, Snap. He really said, "Show me the money." That journalist and editor were so hungry for a story, even though they were like making fun of him half the time. But it's such a neat way to set up a story. Like, now we're gonna find out what happens. Yeah, let me take a sip of my tea here. All right, here we go. Chapter 4, Time Traveling. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine and showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete and in the workshop. There it is now, a little travel-worn truly, and one of the ivory bars is cracked and a brass rail bent, but the rest of it, it's sound enough. I expected to finish it on Friday, but on Friday, when putting together was nearly done, I found that one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short, and this I had to get remade so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other, pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking round, I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened? For a moment, I suspected that my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock. A moment before, as it seemed, it had stood a minute or so past 10, and now it was nearly 3:30. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Mrs. Watchett came in and walked, apparently without seeing me, toward the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or so to traverse the place, but to me, she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black, then day again, night again, day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and a strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I am afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like that one has upon a switchback of a helpless, headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an imminent smash. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping it every minute, and every minute marking a day. I suppose the laboratory had been destroyed and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. The slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then, in the intermittent darkness, I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from new to full and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous grayness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous color like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space. The moon a fainter, fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars, save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside upon which this house now stands, and the shoulder rose above me, gray and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapor. Now brown, now green, they grew, spread, shivered, and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up and faint and fair and pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced round faster and faster. Presently I noticed that the sun belt swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less, and that consequently my pace was over a year a minute, and minute by minute the white snow flashed across the world and vanished, and was followed by the bright green, brief spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into a kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked, indeed, a clumsy swaying of the machine for which I was unable to account. But my mind was too confused to attend to it. So with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. First, I scarce thought of stopping, scarce thought of anything but these new sensations. But presently, a fresh series of impressions grew upon my mind. A certain curiosity, and therewith a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity! What wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization, I thought, might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time, and yet, it seemed, built of glimmer and mist. I saw a richer green flow up the hillside and remain there, without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair, and so my mind came round to the business of stopping. The peculiar risk lie in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I, or the machine, occupied. So long as I traveled at a high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated, was slipping like a vapor through the interstices of intervening. I was slipping like vapor through the intersection of intervening substances. But to come to a stop involved the jamming of myself, molecule by molecule, into whatever lay in my way. Meant bringing my atoms into such intimate contact with those of the obstacle that a profound chemical reaction, Possibly a far-reaching explosion would result and blow myself and my apparatus out of all possible dimensions into the unknown. This possibility had occurred to me again and again while I was making this machine. Then I had cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk, one of the risks a man has got to take. Now that the risk was inevitable, I no longer saw it in the same cheerful light. The fact is that, insensibly, the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all the feeling of prolonged falling, had absolutely upset my nerves. I told myself that I could never stop, and with a gust of petulance I resolved to stop forthwith. Like an impatient fool, I lugged over the lever, and incontinently the whole thing went reeling over, and I was flung headlong through the air. There was the sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. I may have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing round me, and I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed gray, but presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked round me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in a garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes, and I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in a shower under the beating of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a little cloud over the machine and drove along the ground like smoke. In a moment, I was wet to the skin. "Fine hospitality," said I, "to a man who has traveled innumerable years to see you." Presently I thought what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked round me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendrons through the hazy downpour. But all else of the world was invisible. My sensations would be hard to describe. As the columns of hail grew thinner, I saw the white figure more distinctly. It was very large, for a silver birch tree touched its shoulder. It was of white marble, in shape something like a winged sphinx, but the wings, instead of being carried vertically at the sides, were spread so that it seemed to hover. The pedestal, it appeared to me, was of bronze, and was thick with verdigris. It chanced that the face was toward me, the sightless eyes seemed to watch me, and there was the faint shadow of a smile on the lips. It was greatly weather-worn, and that imparted an unpleasant suggestion of disease. I stood looking at it for a little space, half a minute perhaps, or half an hour. It seemed to advance and to recede as the hail drove before it denser or thinner. At last I tore my eyes from it for a moment and saw that the hail curtain had worn threadbare and that the sky was lightening with the promise of the sun. I looked up again at the crouching white shape, and the full temerity of my voyage came suddenly upon me. What might appear when that hazy curtain was altogether withdrawn? What might not have happened to men? What if cruelty had grown into a common passion? What if, in this interval, the race had lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? I might seem some old-world savage animal, only the more dreadful and disgusting for our common likeness, a foul creature to be incontinently slain. Already I saw other vast shapes, huge buildings with intricate parapets and tall columns, with a wooded hillside dimly creeping in upon me through the lessening storm. I was seized with a panic fear. I turned frantically to the time machine and strove hard to adjust it. As I did so, the shafts of the sun smote through the thunderstorm. The gray downpour was swept aside and vanished like the trailing garments of a ghost. Above me, in the intense blue of the summer sky, some faint brown shreds of cloud whirled into nothingness. The great buildings about me stood out clear and distinct, shining with the wet of a thunderstorm, and picked out in white by the unmelted hailstones piled along their courses. I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel in the clear air, knowing the hawk wings above and will swoop. My fear grew to frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth, and again grappled fiercely, wrist and knee, with the machine. It gave under my desperate onset and turned over. It struck my chin violently. One hand on the saddle, the other on the lever, I stood panting heavily, in attitude to mount again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I looked more curiously and less fearfully at this world of the remote future. In a circular opening high up in the wall of the nearer house, I saw a group of figures clad in rich, soft robes. They had seen me, and their faces were directed toward me. Then I heard voices approaching me. Coming through the bushes by the white sphinx were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged in a pathway leading straight to the little lawn upon which I stood with my machine. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic, girdled at the waist with a leather belt. Sandals or buskins, I could not clearly distinguish which, were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees and his head was bare. Noticing that, I noticed for the first time how warm the air was. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, that hectic beauty of which we used to hear so much. At the sight of him, I suddenly regained confidence. I took my hands from the machine. That was chapter 4. You know, something that they said at the end of that chapter, the beautiful kind of consumptive. Back in the day, tuberculosis was very common in the developed world. It's still very common in other parts of the world because of the inequities of healthcare access. But back in the day, they used to call it consumption, and there was a bit of a fad for a while where being thin and gaunt, as you're sick with tuberculosis, was like beautiful. Yeah. And so when he's saying like the flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, that's what I believe he's talking about there. I could be wrong. So I'm going to take a sip of tea and we're going to start the next chapter. Oh, I've been forgetting to change the chapter numbers. We are on chapter 5. In the Golden Age. Chapter 5. In the Golden Age. In another moment, we were standing face to face, I and this fragile thing out of futurity. He came straight up to me and laughed into my eyes. The absence from his bearing of any sign of fear struck me at once. Then he turned to the 2 others who were following and spoke to them in a strange and very sweet liquid tongue. There were others coming, and presently a little group of perhaps 8 or 10 of these exquisite creatures were about me. One of them addressed me. It came into my head, oddly enough, that my voice was too harsh and deep for them. So I shook my head and, pointing to my ears, shook it again. He came a step forward, hesitated, and then touched my hand. Then I felt other soft little tentacles upon my back and shoulders. They wanted to make sure I was real. There was nothing in this at all alarming. Indeed, there was something in these pretty little people that inspired confidence, a graceful gentleness, a certain childlike ease. And besides, they looked so frail that I could fancy myself flinging the whole dozen of them about like ninepins. But I made a sudden motion to warn them when I saw their little pink hands feeling at the time machine. Happily then, when it was not too late, I thought of a danger I had hitherto forgotten. And reaching over the bars of the machine, I unscrewed the little levers that would set it in motion and put them in my pocket. Then I turned again to see what I could do in the way of communication. Looking more nearly into their features, I saw some further peculiarities in their Dresden china type of prettiness. Their hair, which was uniformly curly, came to a sharp end at the neck and cheek. There was not the faintest suggestion of it on the face, and their ears were singularly minute. The mouths were small, with bright red, rather thin lips, and the little chins ran to a point. The eyes were large and mild, and this may seem egotism on my part. I fancied even that there was a certain lack of the interest I might have expected in them. As they made no effort to communicate with me, but simply stood round me smiling and speaking in soft cooing noises to each other, I began the conversation. I pointed to the time machine and to myself. Then, hesitating for a moment how to express time, I pointed to the sun. At once, a quaintly pretty little figure in checkered purple and white followed my gesture, and then astonished me by imitating the sound of thunder. For a moment I was staggered, though the import of his gesture was plain enough. The question had come into my mind abruptly. Were these creatures fools? You may hardly understand how it took me. You see, I had always anticipated that the people of the year 800 and 2000 odd would be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, and everything. Then one of them suddenly asked me a question that showed him to be on the intellectual level of one of our 5-year-old children. He asked me, in fact, if I had come from the sun in a thunderstorm. It let loose the judgment I had suspended upon their clothes, their frail white limbs and fragile features. A flow of disappointment rushed across my mind. For a moment I felt that I had built the time machine in vain. I nodded, pointed to the sun, and gave them such a vivid rendering of a thunderclap as it startled them. They all withdrew a pace or so and bowed. Then came one laughing toward me, carrying a chain of beautiful flowers altogether new to me, and put it about my neck. The idea was received with melodious applause, and presently they were all running to and fro for flowers and laughingly flinging them upon me until I was almost smothered with blossom. You who have never seen the like can scarcely imagine what delicate and wonderful flowers countless years of culture had created. Then someone suggested that their playthings should be exhibited in the nearest building, and so I was led past the Sphinx of white marble, which had seemed to watch me all the while with a smile at my astonishment, towards a vast gray edifice of fretted stone. As I went with them, the memory of my confident anticipations of a profoundly grave and intellectual posterity came with irresistible merriment to my mind. The building had a huge entry and was altogether of colossal dimensions. I was naturally most occupied with the growing crowd of little people and with the big open portals that yawned before me, shadowy and mysterious. My general impression of the world I saw over their heads was a tangled waste of beautiful bushes and flowers, a long neglected and yet weedless garden. I saw a number of tall spikes of strange white flowers measuring a foot, perhaps, across the spread of the waxen petals. They grew scattered, as if wild, among the variegated They grew scattered as if wild among the variegated shrubs, but as I say, I did not examine them closely at this time. The time machine was left deserted on the turf among the rhododendrons. The arch of the doorway was richly carved, but naturally I did not observe the carving very narrowly, though I fancied I saw suggestions of old Phoenician decorations as I passed through, and it struck me that they were very badly broken and weather-worn. Several more brightly clad people met me in the doorway, and so we entered. I, dressed in dingy 19th century garments, looking grotesque enough, garlanded with flowers and surrounded by an eddying mass of bright, soft-colored robes and shining white limbs in a melodious whirl of laughter and laughing speech. The big doorway opened into a proportionately great hall hung with brown. The roof was in shadow, and the windows, partially glazed with colored glass and partially unglazed, admitted a tempered light. The floor was made up of huge blocks of some very hard white metal, not plates or slabs, blocks, and it was so much worn, as I judged by the going to and fro of past generations, as to be deeply channeled along the more frequented ways. Transverse to the length were innumerable tables made of slabs of polished stone, raised perhaps a foot from the floor, and upon these were heaps of fruit. Some I recognized as a kind of hypertrophied raspberry and orange, but for the most part they were strange. Between the tables was scattered a great number of cushions. Upon these my conductors seated themselves, signing for me to do likewise. With a pretty absence of ceremony, they began to eat the fruit with their hands, flinging peel and stalks and so forth into the round openings in the sides of the tables. I was not loath to follow their example, for I felt thirsty and hungry. As I did so, I surveyed the hall at my leisure. And perhaps the thing that struck me most was its dilapidated look. The stained glass windows, which displayed only a geometrical pattern, were broken in many places, and the curtains that hung across the lower end were thick with dust, and it caught my eye that the corner of the marble table near me was fractured. Nevertheless, the general effect was extremely rich and picturesque. There were, perhaps, a couple of hundred people dining in the hall, and most of them seated as near to me as they could come, or watching me with interest, their little eyes shining over the fruit they were eating. All were clad in the same soft and yet strong, silky material. Fruit, by the by, was all their diet. These people of the remote future were strict vegetarians, and while I was with them, in spite of some carnal cravings, I had to be vegetarian also. Indeed, I found afterwards that horses, cattle, sheep, dogs had followed into extinction. But the fruits were very delightful. One in particular that seemed to be in season all the time I was there. A flowery thing in a three-sided husk was especially good, and I made it my staple. First, I was puzzled by all these strange fruits and by the strange flowers I saw. But later, I began to perceive their import. However, I'm telling you of my fruit dinner in the distant future now, so soon as my appetite was a little checked, I determined to make a resolute attempt to learn the speech of these new men of mine. Clearly, that was the next thing to do. These fruits seemed a convenient thing to begin upon, and holding one of these up, I began a series of interrogative sounds and gestures. I had considerable difficulty in conveying my meaning. At first, my efforts met with a stare of surprise or inextinguishable laughter, but presently, a fair-haired little creature seemed to grasp my intention and repeated a name. They had to chatter and explain the business at great length to each other, and my first attempts to make the exquisite little sounds of their language caused an immense amount of genuine, if uncivil, amusement. However, I felt like a schoolmaster amidst children, and I persisted, and presently I had a score of noun substantives. at least in my command. And then I got to demonstrative pronouns and even the verb to eat, but it was slow work, and the little people soon tired and wanted to get away from my interrogations, so I determined, rather of necessity, to let them give their lessons in little doses when they felt inclined. And very little doses I found they were before long, for I never met people more indolent or more easily fatigued. Aha, that is the chapter. Other guy, welcome in, my friend. Other guy, thank you so much for the resub, my friend. I hope you're doing good. I'm late. Can you start again? Oh, yeah. Let me just get these pages here. I hope you're doing well. I'm going to take a quick sip of tea here. Oh, what is that I hear? That you were second? Maybe? Congrats on second, other guy. Maybe. Snap. Oh, spoiler alert. Everyone dies. Happy All Hallows Eve. Also, hi. He's acting slick with that book. We know he's reading from a PDF on Internet Archive or something. Yes, it's an EPUB download from Project Gutenberg. No pictures in this. I'm just listening to an audiobook and just repeating everything he's hearing. That sounds like the hardest thing to do. Exactly. Yeah, I can't read. Snap is reading it to me, and I'm repeating his words. That's exactly what we're doing. Second what? Second place? Yes. Moon's got first today. All right, I'm going to take a sip of tea, and we shall jump back in. We have 7 minutes left before ads. We may have to stop in the middle of the chapter, but that's okay. Second is the first loser. Well, you're the second, so does that make you... It's still the first loser because it's not confirmed, right? It's with a maybe. You guys, snap, you're so silly. All right, here we go. No, Sunny number 1. Yes, number 1 is Sunny. Chapter 6. The Sunset of Mankind. A queer thing I soon discovered about my little hosts, and that was their lack of interest. They would come to me with eager cries of astonishment like children, but like children, they would soon stop examining me and wander away after some other toy. The dinner and my conversational beginnings ended. I noted for the first time that almost all those who had surrounded me at first were gone. It is odd, too, how speedily I came to disregard these little people. I went out through the portal into the sunlit world again, and as soon my hunger was satisfied. I was continually meeting more of these men of the future who would follow me a little distance, chatter and laugh about me, and having smiled and gesticulated in a friendly way, leave me again to my own devices. The calm of evening was upon the world as I emerged from the great hall, and the scene was lit by the warm glow of the setting sun. At first, things were very confusing. Everything was so entirely different from the world I had known, even the flowers. The big building I had left was situated on the slope of a broad river valley, but the Thames had shifted. The big building I had left was situated on the slope of a broad river valley, but the Thames had shifted, perhaps just a mile from its present position. I resolved to mount to the summit of a crest, perhaps a mile and a half away, from which I could get a wider view of this our planet in the year 802,701 AD. But that, I should explain, was the date the little dials of my machine recorded. As I walked, I was watching for every impression that could possibly help to explain the condition of ruinous splendor in which I had found the world. For ruinous it was. A little way up the hill, for instance, was a great heap of granite, bound together by masses of aluminum, a vast labyrinth of precipitous walls and crumpled heaps, amidst which were thick heaps of very beautiful pagoda-like plants. Nettles, possibly, but wonderfully tinted with brown about the leaves and incapable of stinging. It was evidently the derelict remains of some vast structure, and to what end built I could not determine. It was here that I was destined, at a later date, to have a very strange experience. The first intimation of a still stranger discovery. But of that I will speak in its proper place. Looking round with a sudden thought from a terrace on which I rested for a while, I realized that there were no small houses to be seen. Apparently, the single house, possibly even the household, had vanished. Here and there among the greenery were palace-like buildings, but the house and the cottage, which form such characteristic features of our own English landscape, had disappeared. Communism, I said to myself. And on the heels of that came another thought. I looked at the half-dozen little figures that were following me. Then, in a flash, I perceived that all had the same form of costume, the same soft, hairless visage, and the same girlish rotundity of a limb. It may seem strange, perhaps, that I had not noticed this before, but everything was so strange. Now I saw the fact plainly enough. In costume, and in all the differences of texture and bearing that now mark off the sexes from each other, these people of the future were alike, and the children seemed to my eyes to be but the miniatures of their parents. I judged then that the children of that time were extremely precocious, physically at least, and I found afterwards abundant verification of my opinion. Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that this close resemblance of the sexes was, after all, what one would expect, for the strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of the family and the differentiation of occupations are mere militant necessities of an age of physical force. Where population is balanced and abundant, much childbearing becomes an evil rather than a blessing to the state. Where violence comes but rarely and offspring are secure, there is less necessity. Indeed, there is no necessity for an efficient family. You know what? Let's go ahead and take a break. We do have an ad break coming. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the music. We'll catch up with chat for a second. Dad's gonna read his weird old book and ignore us again. I'm reading my stories. Let him enjoy his eyesight while he still has it. His hearing's already gone. You're not wrong on that. I have pretty good hearing, but selective hearing, right? Papa can't work the Kindle. Yeah, it would have been cool to have an actual book. But by the way, if you all are getting these ads, please stand up. Please get yourself a bevy. Don't watch them. And we'll see you in just a few minutes. You went to your granddad's bookshelf the other week, and there was a World War II book he hadn't returned to the library since 1970. I wonder what the library fines on that are. Be fascinating to find out. You should try to take it back. Apologize and see what they say. Oh. But if they try to take it from you, then you just throw it under your arm and go, no, and you run away as fast as you can. Okay. I'll be right back. Thank you for your patience while I stood up and stretched. I hope you did the same. Just gonna bring it up right here, and we can keep on going. The library cop from Seinfeld is gonna come after him. Very scared. The time machine? If I had a time machine, I'd go back to 1895 and tell him to write a better bloody book. Or not to marry his cousin. That's probably some good advice. Now, you may know more than I on this subject, other guy, but this was written at the end of the Victorian era. He was in Victorian London when he wrote this book, and he was, my understanding, a communist. And this book is not one of his more political books, but it is one that really pokes at that social structure. Of course, anti what's the word, hoarding of wealth, very much against that, right? Here we go. So let's see, let me find where we were, and I'll roll back just a little bit. Looking round, with a sudden thought from a terrace on which I rested for a while, I realized that there were no small houses to be seen. Apparently, the single house and possibly even the household had vanished. Here and there among the greenery were palace-like buildings, but the house and the cottage, which form such characteristic features of our own English landscape, had disappeared. Communism, I said to myself. And on the heels of that came another thought. I looked at the half-dozen little figures that were following me. Then, in a flash, I perceived that all had the same form of costume, the same soft, hairless visage, and the same girlishly rotundity of limb. It may seem strange, perhaps, that I had not noticed this before, but everything was so strange. Now I saw the fact plainly enough. In costume, and in all the differences of texture and bearing that now mark off the sexes from each other, these people of the future were alike, and the children seemed to my eyes to be but the miniatures of their parents. I judged then that the children of that time were extremely precocious, physically at least, and I found afterwards abundant verification of my opinion. Seeing the ease and security in which these people were living, I felt that this close resemblance of the sexes was, after all, what one would expect. For the strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of the family, and the differentiation of occupations are mere militant necessities of an age of physical force. Where population is balanced and abundant, much childbearing becomes an evil rather than a blessing to the state. Where violence comes but rarely and offspring are secure, there is less necessity. Indeed, there is no necessity for an efficient family, and the specialization of the sexes with reference to their children's needs disappears. We see some beginnings of this, even now in our own time, and in the future age, it was complete. This, I remind you, was my speculation at the time. Later, I was to appreciate how far it fell short of the reality. While I was musing upon these things, my attention was attracted by a pretty little structure, like a well under a cupola. I thought in a transitory way of the oddness of wells still existing, and then resumed the thread of my speculations. There were no large buildings toward the top of the hill, and as my walking powers were evidently miraculous, I was presently left alone for the first time. With a strange sense of freedom and adventure, I pushed on up to the crest. There, I found a seat of some yellow metal that I did not recognize, corroded in places with a kind of pinkish rust and half smothered in soft moss, the armrests cast and filed into the resemblance of griffins' heads. I sat down on it, and I surveyed the broad view of our old world under the sunset of that long day. It was as sweet and fair as a view I had ever seen. The sun had already gone below the horizon, and the west was flaming gold, touched with some horizontal bars of purple and crimson. Below was the valley of the Thames, in which the river lay like a band of burnished steel. I have already spoken of the great palaces dotted about among the variegated greenery, some in ruins and some still occupied. Here and there rose a white or silvery figure in the waste garden of the earth. Here and there came the sharp vertical line of some cupola or obelisk. There were no hedges, no signs of proprietary rights, no evidences of agriculture. The whole earth had become a garden. So watching, I began to put my interpretation upon the things I had seen, and as it shaped itself to me that evening, my interpretation was something in this way. Afterwards, I found I had only got a half-truth, or only a glimpse of one facet of the truth. It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity upon the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. For the first time, I began to realize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we were present engaged. And yet, come to think, it is a logical consequence enough. Strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. The work of ameliorating the conditions of life, the true civilizing process that makes life more and more secure, had gone steadily on to a climax. One triumph of a united humanity over nature had followed another. Things that are now mere dreams had become projects deliberately put in hand and carried far. And the harvest was what I saw. After all, the sanitation and the agriculture of today are still in the rudimentary stage. The science of our time has attacked but a little department of the field of human disease. But even so, it spreads its operations very steadily and persistently. Our agriculture and horticulture destroy a weed just here and there and cultivate perhaps a score or two of wholesome plants, leaving the greater number to fight out of balance as they can. We improve our favorite plants and animals, and how few they are, gradually by selective breeding. Now a new and better peach, now a seedless grape, now a sweeter and larger flower, now a more convenient breed of cattle. We improve them gradually because our ideals are vague and tentative, and our knowledge is very limited. Because nature, too, is shy and slow in our clumsy hands. Someday, all this will be better organized, and still better. That is the drift of the current in spite of the eddies. The whole world will be intelligent, educated, and cooperating. Things will move faster and faster toward the subjugation of nature. In the end, wisely and carefully we shall readjust the balance of animal and vegetable life to suit our human needs. This adjustment, I say, must have been done, and done well, done indeed for all time, in the space of time across which my machine had leapt. The air was free from gnats, the earth from weeds or fungi. Everywhere were fruits and sweet, delightful flowers. Brilliant butterflies flew hither and thither. The ideal of preventative medicine was attained. Diseases had been stamped out. I saw no evidence of any contagious disease during all my stay, and I shall have to tell you later that even the process of putrefaction and decay had been profoundly affected by these changes. Social triumphs, too, had been affected. I saw mankind housed in splendid shelters, gloriously clothed, and as yet I found them engaged in no toil. There were no signs of struggle, neither social nor economical struggle. The shop, the advertisement, traffic, all that commerce which constitutes the body of our world was gone. It was natural on that golden evening that I should jump at the idea of a social paradise. The difficulty of increasing population had been met, I guessed, and the population had ceased to increase. But with this change in condition comes inevitably adaptations to the change. What, unless biological science is a mass of errors, is the cause of human intelligence and vigor? Hardship and freedom, conditions under which the active, strong, and subtle survive, and the weaker go to the wall. Conditions that put a premium upon the loyal alliance of capable men, upon self-restraint, patience, and decision. The emotions that arise therein, the fierce jealousy, the tenderness for offspring, parental self-devotion, all found their justification and support in the imminent dangers of the young. Now, where are these imminent dangers? There is a sentiment rising, and it will grow, against connubial jealousy, against fierce maternity, against passion of all sorts. Unnecessary things now, and things that make us uncomfortable. Savage survivals, discords in a refined and pleasant life. I thought of the physical slightness of the people, their lack of intelligence in those big, abundant ruins, and it strengthened my belief in a perfect conquest of nature. For after the battle becomes quiet, humanity had been strong, energetic, and intelligent, and had used all its abundant vitality to alter the conditions under which it lived. And now came the reaction of the altered conditions. Under the new conditions of perfect comfort and security, that restless energy that with us is strength would become weakness. Even in our own time, certain tendencies and desires, once necessary to survival, are a constant source of failure. Physical courage and the love of battle, for instance, are no great help, may even be hindrances to a civilized man. And in a state of physical balance and security, power, intellectual as well as physical, would be out of place. For countless years, I judged there had been no danger of war or solitary violence, no danger from wild beasts, no wasting disease to require strength of constitution, no need of toil. For such a life, what we should call the weak are as well equipped as the strong, are indeed no longer weak. Better equipped indeed they are, for the strong would be fretted by an energy for which there was no outlet. No doubt, the exquisite beauty of the buildings I saw was the outcome of the last surgings of the now purposeless energy of mankind before it settled down into perfect harmony with the conditions under which it lived. The flourish, the triumph which began the last great peace. This has ever been the fate of energy and security. It takes to art and to eroticism, and then to languor and decay. Even this artistic impetus would at last die away, had almost died in the time I saw, to adorn themselves with flowers, to dance, to sing in the sunlight. So much was left of the artistic spirit, and no more. Even that would fade in the end into a contented inactivity. We are kept keen, We are kept keen on the grindstone of pain and necessity, and it seemed to me that here was that hateful grindstone broken at last. As I stood there in the gathering dark, I thought that in this simple explanation I had mastered the problem of the world, mastered this whole secret of these delicious people. Possibly the checks they had devised for the increase of population had succeeded too well, and their numbers had rather diminished than kept stationary. That would account for the abandoned ruins. Very simple was my explanation, and plausible enough, as most wrong theories are. It was chapter 6, The Sunset of Mankind. Jerry is a Morlock. If this wasn't a sleepy stream, I would totally do a Morlock impression. I do love Morlocks. I agree, other guy. I love fungi. We don't need to be getting rid of that. It's helpful. It's tasty. Unless they created tasty mushrooms. But those are fungi. But never mind. Let me pour a little bit of tea and then we will jump into chapter 7. There we go. That is the last of my green tea. Let's take a sip. There we go. Chapter 7. A Sudden Shock. As I stood there musing over this too perfect triumph of man, the full moon, yellow and gibbous, came up out of an overflow of silver light in the northeast. The bright little figure ceased to move about below. A noiseless owl flitted by, and I shivered with the chill of the night. I determined to descend and find where I could sleep. I looked for the building I knew. Then my eye traveled along to the figure of the white sphinx upon the pedestal of bronze, growing distinct as the light of the rising moon grew brighter. I could see the silver birch against it. There was the tangle of rhododendron bushes, black in the pale light, and there was the little lawn. I looked at the lawn again. A queer doubt chilled my complacency. No, I stoutly said to myself. That was not the lawn. But it was the lawn, for the white leprous face of the Sphinx was toward it. Can you imagine what I felt as this conviction came home to me? But you cannot. The time machine was gone. At once, like a lash across the face, came the possibility of losing my own age, of being left helpless in this strange new world. The bare thought of it was an actual physical sensation. I could feel it grip me at the throat and stop my breathing. In another moment, I was in a passion of fear and running with great leaping strides down the slope. Once I fell headlong and cut my face. I lost no time in staunching the blood, but jumped up and just ran on with a warm trickle down my cheeks and chin. All the time I ran, I was saying to myself, they've moved it a little, just pushed it under the bushes, out of the way. Nevertheless, I ran with all my might, all the time with the certainty that sometimes comes with excessive dread. I knew that such assurance was folly. I knew instinctively that the machine was removed out of my reach. My breath came with pain. I suppose I covered the whole distance from the hill crest to the little lawn, 2 miles perhaps, in 10 minutes. I am not a young man. I cursed aloud as I ran, at my confident folly in leaving the machine, wasting good breath thereby. I cried aloud, and none answered. Not a creature seemed to be stirring in that moonlit world. When I reached the lawn, my worst fears were realized. Not a trace of the thing was to be seen. I felt cold and faint when I faced the empty space among the black triangle of bushes. I ran round it furiously, as if the thing might be hidden in a corner, and then stopped abruptly, with my hands clutching my hair. Above me towered the Sphinx upon the bronze pedestal, white, shining, leprous in the light of the rising moon. It seemed to smile in mockery of my dismay. I might have consoled myself by imagining the little people had put the mechanism in some shelter for me, had I not felt assured of their physical and intellectual inadequacy. That is what dismayed me, the sense of some hitherto unsuspected power, through whose intervention my invention had vanished. Yet, for one thing I felt assured, unless some other age had produced its exact duplicate, the machine could not have moved in time. The attachment of the levers, I will show you the method later, prevented anyone from tampering with it in that way when they were removed. It had moved and was hid only in space. Then, where could it be? I think I must have had some kind of frenzy. I remember running violently in and out among the moonlit bushes all round the Sphinx and startling some white animal that, in the dim light, I took for a small deer. I remember, too, late that night, beating the bushes with my clenched fist until my knuckles were gashed and bleeding from the broken twigs. Then, sobbing and raving in my anguish of mind, I went down to the great building of stone. The big hall was dark, silent, and deserted. I slipped on the uneven floor and fell over one of my malachite tables. I slipped on the uneven floor and fell over one of the malachite tables, almost breaking my shin. I lit a match and went on past the dusty curtains, of which I've told you. There, I found a second great hall covered with cushions, upon which, perhaps, a score or so of these little people were sleeping. I have no doubt they found my second appearance strange enough, coming suddenly out of the quiet darkness with inarticulate noises and the splutter and flare of a match. But they had forgotten about matches. "Where is my time machine?" I began, bawling like an angry child, laying hands upon them and shaking them up together. It must have been very queer to them. Some laughed. Most of them looked sorely frightened. When I saw them standing round me, it came into my head that I was doing a foolish thing, as it was possible for me to do under this. It came into my head that I was doing as foolish a thing as it was possible for me to do under the circumstances, in trying to revive the sensation of fear. For, reasoning from their daylight behavior, I thought that fear must be forgotten. Abruptly, I dashed down the match, and knocking one of the people over in my course, went blundering across the big dining hall again, out under the moonlight. I heard cries of terror and their little feet running and stumbling this way and that. I do not remember all I did as the moon crept up the sky. I suppose it was the unexpected nature of my loss that maddened me. I felt hopelessly cut off from my own kind, a strange animal in an unknown world. I must have raved to and fro, screaming and crying upon God and fate. I have a memory of horrible fatigue, as the long night of despair wore away, of looking in this impossible place and that, of groping among moonlit ruins and touching strange creatures in the black shadows. At last, of lying on the ground near the Sphinx and weeping with absolute wretchedness even anger at the folly of leaving the machine having leaked away with my strength. I had nothing left but misery. Then I slept, and when I awoke again it was full day, and a couple of sparrows were hopping round me on the turf within reach of my arm. I sat up in the freshness of the morning, trying to remember how I got there, and why I had such a profound sense of desertion and despair. Then, things came clear in my mind. With the plain, reasonable daylight, I could look my circumstances fairly in the face. I saw the wild folly of my frenzy overnight, and I could reason with myself. Suppose the worst, I said. Suppose the machine altogether lost, perhaps destroyed? It behooves me to be calm and patient, to learn the way of the people, to get a clear idea of the method of my loss, and this means of getting materials and tools so that in the end, perhaps, I may make another. That would be my only hope, a poor hope, perhaps, but better than despair. And after all, it was a beautiful and curious world. But probably the machine had only been taken away. Still, I must be calm and patient, find its hiding place, and recover it by force or cunning. And with that, I scrambled to my feet and looked about me, wondering where I could bathe. I felt weary, stiff, and travel-soiled. The freshness of the morning made me desire an equal freshness. I had exhausted my emotion. Indeed, as I went about my business, I found myself wondering at my intense excitement overnight. I made a careful examination of the ground about the little lawn. I wasted some time in futile questionings, conveyed as well as I was able to such of the little people that came by. They all failed to understand my gestures. Some were simply stolid. Some thought it was a jest and laughed at me. I had the hardest task in the world to keep my hands off their pretty, laughing faces. It was a foolish impulse, but the devil begotten of fear and blind anger was ill-curbed and still eager to take advantage of my perplexity. The turf gave bitter counsel. I found a groove ripped in it about midway between the pedestal of the Sphinx and the marks of my feet where, upon arrival, I had struggled with the overturned machine. There were other signs of removal about. There were other signs of removal about, with queer, narrow footprints, like those I could imagine made by a sloth. This directed my closer attention to the pedestal. It was, as I think I have said, of bronze. It was not mere block, but highly decorated with deep-framed panels on either side. I went and rapped at these. The pedestal was hollow. Examining the panels with care, I found them discontinuous with the frames. There were no handles or keyholes, but possibly the panels, if they were doors, as I supposed, opened from within. One thing was clear enough to my mind. It took no very great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside the pedestal. How it got there was a different problem. I saw the heads of two orange-clad people coming through the bushes and under some blossom-covered apple trees toward me. I turned, smiling to them, and beckoned them to me. They came, and then, pointing to the bronze pedestal, I tried to intimate my wish to open it. But at my first gesture toward they behaved very oddly. I don't know how to convey their expression to you. Suppose you were to use a grossly improper, "Oh my gosh, Karif, welcome in, my friend." I will take a pause on the reading. How are you doing tonight, my friend? And Barry, also Barry Booyah. Karif, what were you up to tonight? Hey there, D-Rafter Demon. Let me give Karif a shout out. If you all do not follow Karif Wins, I highly recommend that you do. Sheriff is a fantastic streamer. And oh, you were playing web fishing. Nice. Your chill hangout streams like that are a lot of fun. Definitely a lot of fun. But how was your stream tonight, my friend? And if you need to raid and fade, I completely understand. I know what kind of I know what streaming can take out of you. So please feel free. And I appreciate you entrusting your community here, and I promise to take great care of them. So for those of you who are new here, my name is Jer, and we do a mix of streams. Some are cozy streams like this one. Some are a little less cozy, but by and large, we keep things very quiet and calm around here. And tonight, we are reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It was written in 1895 and is giving, and it's really interesting to read sci-fi from Victorian London, like Victorian United Kingdom, England. I don't know what it was called back then. Definitely London. But it's been very, very intriguing. So while I'm reading, please feel free to chat amongst yourselves. And then what I'm doing is between chapters, I'm just catching up with you all, chatting about what we just read, and then diving back in. So please don't take any offense. If anybody chats, I encourage it. I'll take a sip of my tea and we'll jump in. We are on chapter 7, A Sudden Shock. Quick recap, this time traveler has traveled to the year like 8,000 plus, and he's found a really physically and mentally weak people in the sunset of mankind. That's what he's calling it. And just so you all know, this book is a critique of the Victorian era wealth inequality. So it does have that. But remember, it was written in 1895. So sometimes there's some, let's say, outdated ideas. But overall, not too bad. Barry. Barry says, in 1801, the Kingdom of Ireland was united with England and Scotland. The three became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Most of Ireland became a separate state in 1922, but Northern Ireland stayed part of the UK. In 1927, the name was changed to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Thank you for that. I learned something new today, and I love that. So this would have been, in 1895, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Yay, Victorian era. All right. We'll jump in. Thank you for that info, Barry. I'm not good with history. I'm pretty bad at it. Also, one important fact for you all to know is this guy's time machine was just stolen. He's freaking out. Oh, here we go. He's currently asking people to open a pedestal. I saw the heads of two orange-clad people coming through the bushes and under some blossom-covered apple trees toward me. I turned, smiling to them, and beckoned them to me. They came, and then, pointing to the bronze pedestal, I tried to intimate my wish to open it. But at my first gesture towards this, they behaved very oddly. I don't know how to convey their expression to you. Suppose you were to use a grossly improper gesture to a delicate-minded woman. This is how she would look. They went off as if they had received the last impossible insult. I tried a sweet-looking chap in the white next, with exactly the same result. Somehow, his manner made me feel ashamed of myself. But, as you know, I wanted the time machine, and I tried him once more. As he turned off, like the others, my temper got the better of me. In 3 strides, I was after him, had him by the loose part of his robe round the neck, and began dragging him toward the Sphinx. I saw the horror and repugnance on his face, and all of a sudden I let him go. But I was not beaten yet. I banged with my fist at the bronze panels. I thought I had heard something stir inside. To be explicit, I thought I heard a sound like a chuckle, but I must have been mistaken. Then I got a big pebble from the river and came and hammered till I had flattened a coil in the decorations and the verdigris came off in powdery flakes. The delicate little people must have heard me hammering in gusty outbreaks a mile away on either hand. Nothing came of it. I saw a crowd of them upon the slopes, looking furtively at me. At last, hot and tired, I sat down to watch the place. But I was too restless to watch long. I am too occidental for a long vigil. Could work at a problem for years, but to wait inactive for 24 hours? That is another matter. I got up after a time and began walking aimlessly through the bushes toward the hill again. Patience, I said to myself. If you want your machine again, you must leave that Sphinx alone. If they mean to take your machine away, it's little good you're wrecking their bronze panels. And if they don't, you'll get it back as soon as you can ask for it. To sit among all those unknown things before a puzzle like that is hopeless. That way lies monomania. Face this world. Learn its ways. Watch it. Be careful of too hasty guesses at its meaning. In the end, you will find clues to it all. Then, suddenly, the humor of the situation came into my mind. The thought of the years I had spent in study and toil to get into the future age, and now my passion of anxiety to get out of it. I had made myself the most complicated and the most helpless trap that a man had ever devised. Although it was at my own expense, I could not help myself. I laughed aloud. Going through this big palace, it seemed to me that the little people avoided me. It may have been my fancy, or it may have had something to do with my hammering at the gates of bronze. Yet I felt tolerably sure of the avoidance. I was careful, however, to show no concern and to abstain from any pursuit of them. And in the course of a day or two, things got back to the old footing. I made what progress I could in the language, and in addition, I pushed my explorations here and there. Either I missed some subtle point, or their language was excessively simple, almost exclusively composed of concrete substantives, and verbs. There seemed to be few, if any, abstract terms or little use of figurative language. Their sentences were usually simple and of 2 words, and I failed to convey or understand any but the simplest prepositions. I determined to put the thought of my time machine and the mystery of the bronze doors under the Sphinx as much as possible in a corner of my memory, until my growing knowledge would lead me back to them in a natural way. Yet a certain feeling, you may understand, tethered me in a circle of a few miles round the point of my arrival. That was chapter 7, A Sudden Shock. And ads are going to start in about 5 minutes. We're 40% through the book, and I would love to get halfway through tonight. So what I think I might do is between chapters here, go ahead and run ads. That way we all can escape them for the next hour. I hope that's all right with y'all. Oh, you, Barry, you just Googled it yourself? That's the way to go, my friend. That is efficient. Quite. All right. I will be back in just a few minutes. BRB, y'all. Thank you all for your patience, and welcome back from the advertisements. Barry says your ADHD took you on a random trip right now. Nice. Isn't it crazy? This book was written only 120 years after the American independence. And then I thought, wait, the time of Caesar and Jesus is just about 24 to 30 human lifespans away from us. This does feel so short, right? Those are the moments where history can feel really long and really compact, right? We as people, we haven't been here for that long. And we still have a lot to learn about ourselves and the world. And hopefully this book doesn't come to pass. But, you know, I do like the concept of a peaceful, united humanity. Never apologize for random thoughts, my friend. I want you all to feel like you can just be yourself, just be. And I'm really glad you shared that, to be honest, because it's a really interesting thing to think about. I'm going to change the chapter number. I'll turn this down. Chapter 8. Explanation. So far as I could see, all the world displayed the same exuberant richness as the Thames Valley. From every hill I climbed, I saw the same abundance of splendid buildings, endlessly varied in material and style. The same clustering thickets of evergreens, the same blossom-laden trees and tree ferns. Here and there, water shone like silver, and beyond, the land rose into blue, undulating hills, and so faded into the serenity of the sky. A peculiar feature which presently attracted my attention was the presence of certain circular wells, several, as it seemed to me, of a very great depth. One lay by the path up the hill, which I had followed during my first walk. Like the others, it was rimmed with bronze, curiously wrought and protected by a little cupola from the drain. Sitting by the side of these wells and peering down into the shafted darkness, I could see no gleam of water, nor could I start any reflection with a lighted match. But in all of them, I heard a certain sound. A thud, 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 like the beating of some big engine, and I discovered from the flaring of my matches that a steady current of air set down the shafts. Further, I threw a scrap of paper into the throat of one, and instead of fluttering slowly down, it was at once sucked swiftly out of sight. After a time, too, I came to connect these wells with tall towers standing here and there upon the slopes, for above them there was often just such a flicker in the air as one sees on a hot day above a sun-scorched beach. Putting things together, I reached a strong suggestion of an extensive system of subterranean ventilation, whose true import it was difficult to imagine. I was at first inclined to associate it with the sanitary apparatus of these people. It was an obvious conclusion, but it was absolutely wrong. And here I must admit that I learnt very little of drains and bells and modes of conveyance, and like conveyances. And here I must admit that I learned very little of drains and bells and modes of conveyance and the like conveniences during my time in this real future. Some of these visions of utopias and coming times which I have read, there is a vast amount of detail about building and social arrangements and so forth. But while such details are easy enough to obtain when the whole world is contained in one's imagination, they are altogether inaccessible to a real traveler amid such realities as I found here. Conceive the tale of London. I'm going to skip that sentence. 1895, a little bit of racism. We don't need all of this. How about this? Let me rephrase it because it's an interesting idea, but we're not going to use the verbiage he uses there. Conceive the tale of an outsider. What would he know of railway companies, of social movements, of telephone and telegraph wires, of the parcels delivery company and postal orders and the like? Yet we, at least, should be willing enough to explain these things to him. And even of what he knew, how much could he make his untraveled friend either apprehend or believe? Then think how narrow the gap between these people, and how wide the interval between myself and these of the Golden Age. I was sensible of much which was unseen, and which contributed to my comfort, but save for a general impression of automatic organization, I fear I can convey very little of the difference to your mind. In the matter of sepulture, for instance, I could see no signs of crematoria nor anything suggestive of tombs. but it occurred to me that possibly there might be cemeteries or crematoria somewhere beyond the range of my explorings. This again was a question I deliberately put to myself, and my curiosity was at first entirely defeated upon the point. The thing puzzled me, and I was led to make a further remark which puzzled me still more, that aged and infirm among these people there were none. I must confess that my satisfaction with my first theories of an automatic civilization and a decadent humanity did not long endure. Yet I could think of no other. Let me put my difficulties. The several big palaces I had explored were mere living places, great dining halls and sleeping apartments. I could find no machinery, no appliances of any kind. Yet these people were clothed in pleasant fabrics that must at times need renewal, and their sandals, though undecorated, were fairly complex specimens of metalwork. Somehow, such things must be made, and the little people displayed no vestige of a creative tendency. There were no shops, no workshops, no sign of importations among them. They spent all their time playing gently, bathing in the river, and making love in a half-playful fashion, and eating fruit and sleeping. I could not see how things were kept going. Then, again, about the time machine. Something, I knew not what, had taken it into the hollow pedestal of the White Sphinx. Why? For the life of me, I could not imagine. Those waterless wells, too, those flickering pillars. I felt I lacked a clue. I felt, how should I put it? Suppose you found an inscription with sentences here and there in excellent plain English, and interpolated therewith others made of words, of letters even, absolutely unknown to you. Well, on the third day of my visit, that was how the world of 802,701 presented itself to me. That day, too, I made a friend, of a sort. It happened that, as I was watching some of the little people bathing in a shallow, one of them was seized with cramp and began drifting downstream. The main current ran rather swiftly, but not too strongly for even a moderate swimmer. It will give you an idea, therefore, of the strange deficiency in these creatures when I tell you that none made the slightest attempt to rescue the weakly, crying little thing which was drowning before their eyes. When I realized this, I hurriedly slipped off my clothes, and wading at a point lower down, I caught the poor mite and threw her safe to the land. A little rubbing of the limbs soon brought her round, and I had the satisfaction of seeing she was all right before I left her. I had got to such a low estimate of her kind that I did not expect any gratitude from her. In that, however, I was wrong. This happened in the morning. In the afternoon, I met my little woman, as I believe it was, as I was returning toward my center from exploration. And she received me with cries of delight and presented me with a big garland of flowers, evidently made for me and me alone. The thing took my imagination. Very possibly I had been feeling desolate. At any rate, I did my best to display my appreciation of the gift. We were soon seated together in a little stone arbor, engaged in conversation, chiefly of smiles. The creature's friendliness affected me exactly as a child's might have done. We passed each other flowers, and she kissed my hands. I did the same to hers. Then I tried to talk, and found that her name was Weena, which, though I don't know what it meant, somehow seemed appropriate enough. That was the beginning of a queer friendship which lasted a week, and ended as, well, I will tell you. She was exactly like a child. She wanted to be with me always. She tried to follow me everywhere, and on my next journey out and about, it went to my heart to tire her down. and leave her at last exhausted and calling after me rather plaintively. But the problems of the world had to be mastered. I had not, I said to myself, come into this future to carry on a miniature flirtation. Yet her distress when I left her was very great. Her expostulations at the parting were sometimes frantic, and I think, altogether, I had as much trouble as comfort from her devotion. Nevertheless, she was, somehow, a very great comfort. I thought it was mere childish affection that made her cling to me. Until it was too late, I did not clearly know what I had inflicted upon her when I left her. Nor until it was too late did I clearly understand what she was to me. For, by merely seeming fond of me, and showing in her weak, futile way that she cared for me, the little doll of a creature presently gave my return to the neighborhood of the White Sphinx almost the feeling of coming home. And I would watch for her tiny figure of white and gold so soon as I came over the hill. It was from her, too, that I learned that fear had not yet left this world. She was fearless enough in the daylight, and she had the oddest confidence in me. For once, in a foolish moment, I made threatening grimaces at her. She simply laughed at them. But she dreaded the dark, dreaded shadows, dreaded dark things. Darkness to her was the one thing dreadful. It was a singularly possessive, it was a singularly passionate emotion, and it set me thinking and observing. I discovered then, among other things, that these little people gathered into the great houses after dark and slept in droves. To enter upon them without a light was to put them into a tumult of apprehension. I never found one of the doors, nor one of the sleeping. I never found one out of doors, or one sleeping alone within doors after dark. Yet I was still such a blockhead that I missed the lesson of that fear, and in spite of Weena's distress, I insisted upon sleeping away from these slumbering multitudes. It troubled her greatly, but in the end her odd affection for me triumphed, and for 5 of the nights our acquaintance, including the last night of all, she slept with her head pillowed on my arm. But my story slips away from me as I speak of her. It must have been the night before her rescue that I was awakened about dawn. I had been restless, dreaming most disagreeably that I was drowned, and that sea anemones were feeling all over my face with their soft palps. I woke with a start, and with an odd fancy that some grayish animal had just rushed out of the chamber. I tried to get to sleep again, but I felt restless and uncomfortable. It was in that dim, gray hour when things are just creeping out of darkness, when everything is colorless and clear-cut and yet unreal. I got up and went down into the great hall, and so out upon the flagstones in front of the palace. I thought I would make a virtue of necessity and see the sunrise. The moon was setting, and the dying moonlight and the first pallor of dawn were mingled in a ghastly half-light. The bushes were inky black, and the ground a somber gray, the sky colorless and cheerless, and up the hill I thought I could see ghosts. 3 several times. As I scanned the slope, I saw white figures. Twice I fancied I saw a solitary white, ape-like creature running rather quickly down the hill, and once near the ruins I saw a leash of them carrying some body. They moved hastily. I did not see what became of them. It seemed that they vanished among the bushes. Dawn was still indistinct, but you must understand, I was feeling that chill, uncertain, early morning feeling you may have known. I doubted my eyes. As the eastern sky grew brighter, and the light of the day came on and its vivid coloring returned upon the world once more, I scanned the view keenly, but I saw no vestige of my figures. They were mere creatures of the half-light. They must have been ghosts, I said. I wonder whence they dated. For a queer notion of Grant Allen's came into my head and amused me. If each generation die and leave ghosts, he argued, the world will at last get overcrowded with them. On that theory, they would have grown innumerable some 800,000 years hence, and it was no great wonder to see 4 at once. But the jest was unsatisfying, and I was thinking of these figures all the morning, until Weena's rescue drove them out of my head. I associated them in some indefinite way with the white animal I had startled in my first passionate search for the time machine, but Weena was a pleasant substitute. Yet, all the same, they were soon destined to take far deadlier possession of my mind. I think I have said how much hotter than our own was the weather of this golden age. I cannot account for it. It may be that the sun was hotter or the earth nearer the sun. It is usual to assume the sun will go on cooling steadily in the future, but people unfamiliar with such speculations as those of the younger Darwin forget the planets must ultimately fall back one by one into the parent body. As these catastrophes occur, the sun will blaze with renewed energy, and it may be that some inner planet has suffered this fate. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that the sun was very much hotter than we knew it. Well, one very hot morning, my 4th, I think, as I was seeking shelter from the heat and glare in a colossal ruin near the great house where I slept and fed, there happened this strange thing. Clambering among these heaps of masonry, I found a narrow gallery whose in and side windows were blocked by fallen masses of stone. By contrast with the brilliancy outside, it seemed at first impenetrably dark to me. I entered it groping, for the change from light to blackness made spots of color swim before me. Suddenly, I halted, spellbound. A pair of eyes, luminous by reflection against the daylight without, was watching me out of the darkness. The old instinctive dread of wild beasts came upon me. I clenched my hands and steadfastly looked into the glaring eyeballs. I was afraid to turn. Then the thought of absolute security in which humanity appeared to be living came to my mind, and I remembered that strange terror of the dark. Overcoming my fear to some extent, I advanced a step and spoke. I will admit that my voice was harsh and ill-controlled. I put out my hand and touched something soft. At once the eyes darted sideways, and something white ran past me. I turned with my heart in my mouth and saw a queer, little ape-like figure, its head held down in a peculiar manner running across the sunlit space behind me. It blundered against a block of granite, staggered aside, and in a moment was hidden in a black shadow beneath another pile of ruined masonry. My impression of it is, of course, imperfect, but I know it was a dull white and had strange, large, grayish-red eyes. Also that there was a flaxen hair on its head and down its back. But, as I say, it went too fast for me to see distinctly. I cannot even say whether it ran on all fours or only with its forearms held very low. After an instant's pause, I followed it into the second heap of ruins. I could not find it at first, but after a time, in the profound obscurity, I came upon one of those round, well-like openings of which I have told you, half closed by a fallen pillar. A sudden thought came to me. Could this thing have vanished down the shaft? I lit a match, and looking down, I saw a small, white, moving creature with large, bright eyes, which regarded me steadfastly as it retreated. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider. It was clambering down the wall, and now I saw for the first time a number of metal foot and hand rests forming a kind of ladder down the shaft. Then, the light burned my fingers and fell out of my hand, going out as it dropped. And when I had lit another, the little monster had disappeared. I do not know how long I sat peering down that well. It was not for some time that I could succeed in persuading myself that the thing I had seen was human. But gradually, the truth dawned on me that man had not remained one species, but had differentiated into two distinct animals. That my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but that this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing which had flashed before me was also heir to all the ages. I thought of the flickering pillars and of my theory of an underground ventilation. I began to suspect their true import. And what, I wondered, was this lemur doing in my scheme of a perfectly balanced organization? How was it related to the indolent serenity of the beautiful overworlders? And what was hidden down there, at the foot of that shaft? I sat upon the edge of the well, telling myself that, at any rate, there was nothing to fear, and that I must descend for the solution of my difficulties. And withal I was absolutely afraid to go. As I hesitated, two of the beautiful upper world people came running in their amorous sport across the daylight in the shadow. The male pushed the female, flinging flowers at her. The male pursued the female, flinging flowers at her as he ran. They seemed distressed to find me, my arm against the overturned pillar, peering down the well. Apparently it was considered bad form to remark these apertures, for which I pointed to this one and tried to frame a question about it in their tongue. They were still more visibly distressed, and I turned away. They were interested in my matches, and I struck some to amuse them. I tried them again about the well, and again I failed. So presently I left them, meaning to go back to Weena and see what I could get from her. But my mind was already in revolution. My guesses and impressions were slipping and sliding to a new adjustment. I had now a clue to the import of these wells, to the ventilating towers, to the mystery of the ghosts, to say nothing of a hint at the meaning of the bronze gates and the fate of the time machine. And very vaguely, there came a suggestion toward the solution of the economic problem that had puzzled me. Here was the new view. Plainly, this second species of man was subterranean. There were three circumstances in particular which made me think that its rare emergence above ground was the outcome of a long-continued underground habit. In the first place, there was a bleached look common in most animals that live largely in the dark. The white fish of the Kentucky caves, for instance. Then those large eyes with that capacity for reflecting light are common features of nocturnal things. Witness the owl and the cat. And last of all, that evident confusion in the sunshine, that hasty yet fumbling, awkward flight toward dark shadow, and that peculiar carriage of the head while in the light, all reinforced the theory of an extreme sensitiveness of the retina. Beneath my feet, then, the earth must be tunneled enormously, and these tunnelings were the habitat of this new race. The presence of ventilating shafts and wells among the hill slopes, everywhere, in fact, except along the river valley, showed how universal were its ramifications. What so natural, then, as to assume that it was in this artificial underworld that such work as was necessary to the comfort of the daylight race was done? The notion was so plausible that I at once accepted it and went on to assume the how of this splitting of the human species. I dare say you will anticipate the shape of my theory, though for myself, I felt very soon that it fell far short of the truth. At first, proceeding from the problems of our own age, it seemed clear as daylight to me that the gradual widening of the present, merely temporary and social difference between the capitalist and the laborer was the key to the whole position. No doubt it will seem grotesque enough to you and wildly incredible, and yet even now there are existing circumstances to point that way. There is a tendency to utilize underground space for the less ornamental purposes of civilization. There is the Metropolitan Railway in London, for instance. There are the new electric railways. There are subways. There are underground workrooms and restaurants, and they increase and multiply. Evidently, I thought, this tendency had increased till industry had gradually lost its birthright in the sky. I mean that it had gone deeper and deeper into larger and ever larger underground factories, spending a still increasing amount of its time therein till, in the end, even now, does not an East End worker live in such artificial conditions as practically to be cut off from the natural surface of the earth? Again, the exclusive tendency of richer people, due no doubt to the increasing refinement of their education, and the widening gulf between them and the rude violence of the poor, is already leading to the closing, in their interest, of considerable portions of the surface of the land. About London, for instance, perhaps half the prettier country is shut in against intrusion, and this same widening gulf, which is due to the length and expanse of the higher educational process and the increased facilities for and temptation towards refined habits on the part of the rich, will make that exchange between class and promotion by marriage, which presents the splitting of our species along lines of social stratification, less and less frequent. So, in the end, above ground, you must have the haves, pursuing pleasure and comfort and beauty, and below ground, the have-nots, the workers getting continually adapted to the conditions of their labor. Once they were there, they would no doubt have to pay rent, and not a little of it, for the ventilation of their caverns. And if they refused, they would starve or be suffocated for arrears. Such of them as were so constituted as to be miserable and rebellious would die, and, in the end, the balance of being permanent, the survivors would become as well adapted to the conditions of underground life, and as happy in their way as the overworld people were to theirs. And it seemed to me the refined beauty and the told pallor followed naturally enough. The great triumph of humanity I had dreamed of took a different shape in my mind. It had been no such triumph of moral education and general cooperation as I had imagined. Instead, I saw a real aristocracy, armed with a perfect science and working to a logical conclusion, the industrial system of today. Its triumph had not been simply a triumph over nature, but a triumph over nature and the fellow man. This, I must warn you, was my theory at the time. I had no convenient Cicerone in the pattern of the utopian books. My explanation may be absolutely wrong. I still think it is the most plausible one. But even on this supposition, the balanced civilization that was at last attained must have long since passed its zenith, and was now far fallen into decay. The too perfect security of the overworlders had led them to a slow movement of denigration, to a general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence. That I could see clearly enough already. What had happened to the undergrounders I did not yet suspect, but from what I had seen of the Morlocks, that by the by was the name by which these creatures were called, I could imagine that the modification of the human type was even far more profound than among the Eloi, beautiful race that I already knew. Then came the troublesome doubts. Why had the Morlocks taken my time machine? For I felt sure it was they who had taken it. Why, too, if the Eloi were masters, could they not restore the machine to me? And why were they so terribly afraid of the dark? I proceeded, as I have said, to question Weena about this underworld, but here again I was disappointed. At first, she would not understand my questions, and presently she refused to answer them. She shivered as though the topic was unendurable, and when I pressed her, perhaps a little harshly, she burst into tears. They were the only tears except my own I ever saw in that golden age. When I saw them, I ceased abruptly to trouble about the Morlocks, and was only concerned in banishing these signs of her human inheritance from Weena's eyes. And very soon she was smiling and clapping her hands, while I solemnly burnt a match. Dang. That was a deep chapter. All the talk about time machines and time travel, and now we're talking about politics in Victorian London. Ruru, welcome in, my friend. You are totally second. I won't tell anybody. Totally second. I hope you're doing great, my friend. I'm actually about to raid out, though. We've been reading for about 3 hours, and we got halfway through the book. So we only need one more stream to finish it. Oh, Barry Booyah. You were wondering what they said. Let me catch up on what you said here. I'll bring us up some music. Now you're interested in what they said. Yeah, it was definitely equating people of different races with different intellectual abilities. And so that's why I translated it from like Victorian racism to 2024 a little bit. I tried. Yeah, imagine going back, as Barry says, imagine going back to ancient times with the knowledge of today. Even though we might not know how to build a phone or a lightning bulb, but even with our limited ability to do maths, read, and the knowledge about atoms and evolution, etc., we would be considered oracles or chosen ones by the gods in ancient Rome. That is true. That is true. Is that what you're going to do with a time machine? Are you going to go back and be worshipped? It's not altogether a terrible idea. I've heard of worse things you could do with a time machine. I bet. Let me see who's streaming tonight. And if anybody is streaming, reading, I was looking a little bit earlier and it seemed like there might be some people reading a book. Let's see. Oh, Caretaker Saxon is on again. We could go there. Try one other thing before we raid out. Just checking everybody. Yes, let's go ahead and raid Caretaker Saxon. They are a VTuber who also reads, and tonight they are reading Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, which is the actual title of the book. So they are in there reading Mary Shelley's original fiction, and I think we should go in there and enjoy the spooky vibes. You know, I've already had my spooky fun here on stream for the year, but doesn't mean we can't go do some cozy spooky reading. So let's see, we're gonna raid. Oh, there's our raid message. And there we go. I always want to find somebody who's matching our vibe from the night, you know? And I hope that you find it to be very cozy over there, because I do. All right, thank you all again. I'm going to be back here on Friday with our final roller coaster, final Planet Coaster stream, Planet Coaster 1. Then we move into the new game, Planet Code 2. I hope you all have a wonderful night, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.